stone or wood or what?
It's all flint. It's all flint coursing stone.
Higher.
Flint. It's all flint walls. Yeah.
Flint walls right
Yeah,
up to
that's
the
pretty.
top.
Again, if you go to Portchester, the Roman walls there are a good sort of 8 metres high still, so they could build that high in flint. Yeah, that's the standard material. Right, I'll hand you the stick of power.
Thank you. Well, you're looking at one of the most remarkable mosaics found in this country as a work of art and also for the subjects that it covers. It's one of the few mosaics that we have that more or less is based on one single story, and that of Pelops. I used to call it the Triumph of Bellerophon because of this panel, but I now call it the Triumphs of Pelops and Bellerophon. Several years ago, or 2 years ago, I was sent a photograph of this corner. It shows a telemon. A telemon is an architectural pillar-like thing that holds up a building, rather like it's a male version of a caryatid, the female figures you'll find on buildings. I thought it was a joke, first of all, because we've never had anything like it in Britain. The only one I know of in the same pose, which is walking, as all of them are, is in the Vatican, from a mosaic at Tusculum that was found in the 18th century. The importance of this floor is the subjects that it covers, and also the fact that it breaks many of the rules that we thought was standard on Roman mosaic. Things don't stay in their frames, and at first I thought it was a quirk of the mosaicist himself, but I now realise that at this period everything like manuscript illumination and ivory book covers, if you study them, you'll find that the figures are all breaking out of their frames. Either feet come out or hands come out. So this is a really up-to-date work of art dating from the mid 4th century, perhaps about 350, but we don't know the exact date. The reason we know it is a 4th century mosaic is that people are wearing fashionable costume. There are things called orbicula, and these are roundels that people wore on their tunics. Here you can see Bellerophon, or you may be able to see Bellerophon is wearing an orbiculum on his shoulder here, and he's also got something called a clavus, or clavi if there's two of them, that were stripes that came down the side of the neck. So he's fashionably dressed as well. The mosaicists obviously tried to give this floor a trompe-l'oeil or three-dimensional feel about it. So what you're supposed to be seeing is a pergola held up by giants with things going on around the garden here, plants and various fights. If you notice that all of the telemon have been foreshortened, in art that means that they sort of taper. They're also once again stepped out of their frames, and this is another thing that you're supposed to think they're standing upright. They have rather strange muscles, and this mosaicist is very keen on giving everybody red nipples and a red belly button. But he doesn't waste any tessera, the little stones, on giving them genitals. So nobody's endowed at all, I'm afraid. If we work our way round the mosaic, we first of all got a scene which is the first in Britain of Hercules with his club about to kill a centaur who looks extremely placid about it, but they are in a pose which I call the fatal pose, where in Greek and Roman statuary, if the assailant grabs onto the hair of the victim has his hand holding onto his assailant's wrist. And you know then, if they're in that pose, that they've had it. And I'm afraid the poor centre has had it. But he's wearing a nice fur cloak, and even this has got a fashionable orbiculum on it. Here we come to a Cupid who's jumping out of his roundel. Notice he has, like at Chedworth Roman villa, he's wearing a sash. But unlike at Chedworth, where they wrap round the waist, the mosaicist often it seems to have velcroed it to his back, because there's nothing holding it on. This is he's lost his face, poor thing, but the muscles on his chest look like a smiley face, so I always call him Happy Tummy. Here we have a wine cup, a Cantharus wine cup, and it refers to the name of the king that I will go back to in a moment. In this corner you'll notice that there's damage. This has not been caused by the land drain which went in, but in fact the mosaic was laid over a filled-in either well or rubbish pit, and over the centuries the content of that, which was obviously not stamped down, sunk, and the mosaic sunk with it. So we were really very pleased to find another 6 inches of mosaic here going down the sides. Here again another Cupid. When I first saw these, I thought that they were going to be seasons, but they all have the same attribute, a wreath. And I think that these are wreaths of triumph, because the whole floor is about conquering something. So rather than seasons, these are Cupids holding what was considered to be a wreath of triumph that was given to victors. Unfortunately, Happy Face over there, the mosaicist forgot what he was doing and gave him a white and red one, where everybody else has got a red one. This is a very nice figure that I think must be Hyas, the famous archer and hunter. You can see he's firing, he's wearing fashionable clothes again. You notice here the orbicular, and he's firing behind the teleman into the other border. Now this is highly unusual, and it's just like manuscript illuminations would be. He's firing into the lion here, and a splendid lion with lovely sharp teeth and a red tongue and plenty of blood. So that's been really popular with the excavators. Here again we have another triumphal Cupid, and this panel's unfortunately been badly damaged, and I think it must be, apart from the fact it's very small, minute tesserae used here, it's not of the same standard as the animals in the other section. This shows a richly garbed young man with a bridle, and I took this down as Alexander taming Bucephalus, triumphing over Bucephalus. Bucephalus, who later became his favourite horse, nobody could ride him, and they were going to get rid of him, and then Alexander realised that why he was so uncontrollable was he was afraid of his own shadow, literally. So Alexander leads him away from his shadow, and after that he becomes calm. I don't know what he did again once he saw his shadow, but nobody mentions that. Now the subject of the whole L-shaped area of this pavement is the triumph of Pelops. Pelops came from Asia Minor, and he wanted to marry Princess Hippodamia. Now, I'm afraid when the roof collapsed in flames here, Hippodamia lost her head, although her neck's there, and she turned blue with the burning. But this is the top of her body. She's partially naked, in the typical sort of princess fashion, throwing her arms about with shawls and things. Not the pose that a real princess of that period would have portrayed, but she's mythological, of course, so you can get away with all sorts of things. To the right of her is a throne. And sitting on the throne are the remains of King Eonomius. And his name means man of wine, which presumably is why they have a wine cup above his name as an added clue to who he is. We've unfortunately lost the inscription that used to run along the top there. Eonomius's feet come down here, and he has very peculiar toes that stick up like that. Over here we have the only representation in Britain of a 4th century warrior. A friend of mine on Hadrian's Wall wrote a book recently, and he bemoaned the fact that there were no 4th century representations of warriors in this country surviving. And so I wrote back to him and said, yes, one's just been found. And as you see, he's got clavi either side of his neck, a spear, a shield, and a nice cloak, and a very nice face. This was one of the only faces that survived from the first excavation. And our mosaicist has a very strange way of doing hands. He puts 2 bands across, which presumably is the end of the sleeve, and then you'll either get 2 fingers going like this, or you might get 3 fingers going like that. But the little fellow here is pointing across to show the viewer Hippodamia there. Now, going back to the legend of Pelops, Pelops wanted to marry the princess Hippodamia, and he travels to the kingdom, which is now in the area we call the Peloponnese, and he wanted to he asked the king to marry if he could marry the princess. Now, the king had been told that his son-in-law, whoever that would be the death of him, literally. And so he'd had 18 previous suitors for the princess, and all 18 were now dead and their heads up in the palace. And so what he did, he challenged everyone to a chariot race, but at the same time he put the princess in the opponent's chariot so they went slower, and out of courtesy to her, and of course lost their heads at the end of it. Now, Pelops had been the lover of the king's chariot master at one time. He'd also been the lover of Poseidon, the god of the sea. In those days there was no such thing as homosexuality or heterosexuality. It was just sex, and nobody thought anything of it. But here you see Myrtilus, who was the chariot master, and in his hand he holds a small thing which was the clue to me to what this pavement represented. The plot was that Myrtilus would replace the linchpin of the king's chariot with a wax one, so that when the king drove round the course, the wheels would fly off the chariot and he'd be killed, which he was. Myrtilus was promised half the kingdom and the first night with the bride. And here you can see the king in the chariot with his whip. And this, incidentally, is a wonderful, although they've gone wrong with the perspective, but it shows a proper racing chariot. These are very low, made of wickerwork, not like the huge things you see in Ben-Hur, which never existed. And they have a wickerwork design inside them. There are also reins round the waist of the king. Our mosaicist had a wonderful way, if I haven't said already, with doing mains. He uses very long, thin tesserae and intersperses dark with light and makes beautiful curving mains that have a sort of texture to them. So he's got 4 horses here, so we know it's a 4-horse, a quadriga racing chariot. At the end here, there's the finishing line, and you can see the feet and sash and face and upper body of the figure that is Pelops. And as I said, the linchpin in this little man's hand was what told me what the story was that we were uncovering here, because I went through various scenarios of what we were uncovering, and when I found that, I realized what it was. But here, as a second bit of proof, you've got the remains, the curve of a P, E-L-O-P-S, so Pelops. As I said, there was a connection with Poseidon here. There's also a connection with Poseidon in this panel here. This is the triumph of Bellerophon over the fire-breathing Chimera. Now, Bellerophon was sent to the court of Iobates with a letter to say, kill the bearer of this. Because Iobates' daughter, who was married to a king in Greece called Proetus, had tried to seduce Bellerophon, and he had rejected her, and so like Potiphar's wife, she had said that he'd tried to rape her. So the king, Proetus, the king, sent him to his father-in-law with a letter, kill the bearer, but unfortunately Iobates, the king, was so intent on entertaining him that he left it for 8 days before he read the letter, and it was considered extremely bad form to kill a guest after 8 days. So in order to get rid of him, he thought, oh, I'll send him to kill the Chimera, which was ravaging the country. And with the help of Athene, also called Minerva by the Romans, he managed to tame the winged stallion Pegasus, who actually was his half-brother, because Poseidon was Bellerophon's father by a mortal woman, but so was Pegasus. And the reason for this is that Medusa, who you know with the snakes in her hair and the frightful face, had once been a beautiful woman, and Poseidon had seduced her in the temple of Athene, and the virgin goddess was so incensed at this that she turned Medusa into this frightful creature. But when Perseus cut off Medusa's head, Pegasus and a humanoid brother called Chrysaor jump out of the severed neck, fully grown, and so they are half-brothers and both have the same father. But anyway, they fly off, and you can see, well, you probably won't be able to see, but we've got reconstructions in the marquee. This is Bellerophon's cloak, and around here, this is his tunic. Here's Pegasus's head and his forelimbs, which break into the guilloche, and his hind limbs also break into the inscriptions, which before I realized that made reading the inscription even worse, because there were 2 extra eyes. You've got the Chimera here, who's drawn like that lion because it has the head of a lion and the body of a lion, but from its back there's a goat coming out that also breathes fire, and its tail, which is lost, was a snake that breathed fire. So Bellerophon shoves his spear with a lump of lead into the mouth of the goat. The lead melts in the fire and chokes the animal to death. So he is triumphant. Now, something about the inscriptions, just to finish up. This is a wonderful inscription, which Cupio Vivus, which refers to, of course, this, and it says, "I want to live," which is a sort of a wonderful title of a paper, you know, a lecture. I haven't been able to translate this because we've unfortunately lost the middle of it, but the whole thing must refer to this plot, because there's a word, the Latin word to connive, in the middle of it. So no doubt the whole inscription probably told you about the plot. There's another little, there's Bellerophon's name over the top there, and that's called, there is called Bellerophontes, which is the same spelling as a mosaic in Spain. And here, as I said, there's his name, Pelops. And I can't remember if I told you this, but one of the reasons this is so important is that there are only two other representations of the Pelops story that include the chariot race in the whole Roman Empire. One is in Damascus, and the other is in a newly discovered palace in Spain at a place called Najeda. So it's pretty wonderful to find one in Boxford. And I think that's about all, really. So.